Sign here, and the Henderson acquisition will be complete, I said, sliding the contract across the polished mahogany table to my father-in-law, Harold Wilson. His eyes darted nervously between me and his son, Mark, who stood with his arm around his new wife, Natalie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The boardroom fell silent as Harold's trembling hand reached for the pen. By the way, I added casually, that inheritance fund you redirected to Natalie last month? Those were company shares, my company shares. Harold's face drained of color as the realization hit him. Behind him, Mark's confident smirk dissolved into confusion. Natalie's hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching the diamond pendant Harold had given her from my grandmother's collection. Congratulations on your recent promotion to regional manager, Natalie, I continued, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions in my chest. As of today, you report directly to me. I stood, smoothing my blazer. Welcome to Taylor Technologies, my company. 5 years earlier, I was just Jessica Taylor, a software developer with a promising algorithm and bigger dreams. I'd spent 3 years creating a revolutionary data analysis program in my apartment after work hours, fueled by instant ramen and determination. My application could predict consumer behavior patterns with unprecedented accuracy, and major retailers were already expressing interest in beta testing. That's when I met Mark Wilson at a tech conference in Denver. Mark wasn't like the other tech guys I'd dated. Tall, with thoughtful brown eyes and a disarming smile, he managed investments for his father's financial firm, Wilson & Associates. Your presentation blew everyone away, he told me, offering to buy me coffee afterward. I've never seen predictive modeling that intuitive before. Unlike others who saw only dollar signs when they looked at my work, Mark asked questions about the development process, the challenges I'd overcome, the potential applications beyond retail. Our relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Mark understood the late nights coding, the frustrations when a bug appeared, the elation when a solution clicked into place. You're going to change the industry, he'd say, massaging my shoulders as I worked. Let me help you get there faster. When he proposed 8 months after we met, I said yes without hesitation. Mark's family was old Denver money. His father, Harold, had transformed a small accounting firm into Wilson & Associates, a financial empire that managed investments for half the business elite in Colorado. Their Tudor-style mansion in Cherry Creek testified to generations of wealth and influence. The first time Mark brought me home, I felt like I'd stepped into another world. Harold Wilson sat at the head of the dining table like a king overseeing his court. In his 60s, with steel-gray hair and calculating eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything. His wife, Margaret, perfectly coiffed and polished, evaluated me with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Software development, Margaret repeated when Mark explained my career. How modern. Her tone suggested this wasn't a compliment. Jessica has created a predictive algorithm that's going to revolutionize retail analytics, Mark said proudly. 3 major chains are already incorporating her beta version. Harold's interest visibly peaked. Is that right? And what's your monetization strategy? I'm exploring options, I answered carefully. Right now, I'm focused on perfecting the technology before scaling. Smart girl, Harold nodded approvingly. Too many startups rush to market before their product is ready. He raised his wine glass. To Jessica and her promising future. The toast felt genuine, but something in his appraising gaze made me uneasy. Later, as Mark drove us home, he squeezed my hand. They loved you, he assured me. Dad doesn't give compliments easily. Our wedding 6 months later was the social event of the season. Margaret hired Denver's most exclusive wedding planner, insisting on controlling every detail from the venue to the flowers. When I suggested incorporating personal touches, code snippets in the programs, tables named after famous women in tech, Margaret's high laugh was gentle but dismissive. "Darling, the Wilson name means something in this city," she explained, patting my hand. "Let's keep things traditional, shall we?" Mark played peacemaker. "Mom just wants everything to be perfect," he said. "And honestly, don't you want to focus on your software launch instead of centerpieces?" He was right. My company was at a critical stage. 2 major retailers had signed contracts after successful beta testing, and I was working 18-hour days to meet the launch deadline. So I surrendered the wedding planning to Margaret, focusing instead on building what would become Taylor Technologies. The week before our wedding, Mark suggested something that initially seemed practical. "You're working insane hours on your business, and I'm handling all these family investments," he pointed out. "Why don't we simplify? Dad's firm can manage the business incorporation, investments, everything. You focus on development, and we'll handle the financial side." It made sense at the time. Harold's firm had a stellar reputation, and having experts manage the business aspects would free me to focus on the technology. So I agreed, signing paperwork that established Taylor Technologies as a corporation with investment management through Wilson and Associates. The wedding was picture perfect, exactly as Margaret had planned. As we exchanged vows beneath a canopy of white roses, I pushed aside the nagging thought that nothing about the ceremony reflected me or my values. Mark looked at me with such adoration that everything else seemed insignificant by comparison. Our first year of marriage passed in a productive blur. Taylor Technologies secured 5 major retail clients, and I expanded my team to 15 developers. Mark supported me completely, attending client dinners, listening to my ideas, celebrating each milestone. When I was invited to speak at the National Technology Conference, he sat in the front row beaming with pride. Harold took an active interest in my company's growth, often stopping by our house to discuss expansion strategies. "You've got something special here, Jessica," he told me, reviewing our quarterly numbers. "With the right management, this could be a nationwide operation within 5 years." His advice seemed sound, and I appreciated his mentorship. When he suggested moving Taylor Technologies to the Wilson and Associates building downtown to save on overhead and increase collaboration, I initially hesitated but eventually agreed. The move would put me closer to Mark, and having legal and financial resources in the same building made practical sense. The first subtle changes began after the relocation. Harold started dropping by my office unannounced, often bringing potential investors or clients without checking my schedule first. "Just wanted to show them the operation," he'd say when I emerged from deep coding sessions to find strangers examining our workspace. "Jessica's the technical genius behind it all," he'd introduce me, as if I were merely an employee rather than the founder and CEO. Mark assured me this was just his father's way of supporting my growth. "Dad's connected to everyone who matters in this city," he reminded me. "He's putting Taylor Technologies on their radar." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isn't that what you want? At family dinners, Harold increasingly steered conversations toward my company's operations. "Have you considered outsourcing some of the development work?" he asked one evening. "I know firms in India that could do the base coding at a quarter of the cost." "The quality of our code is our differentiator," I replied firmly. "I'm not interested in cutting corners." Harold exchanged glances with Mark. "No one's suggesting cutting corners, Jessica. But as the company grows, you'll need to think like a businesswoman, not just a developer." "I am a businesswoman," I said, setting down my fork. "One whose business is currently exceeding projected revenues by 30%. Margaret quickly changed the subject, but the tension lingered. Later that night, Mark suggested I might have overreacted. "Dad's just trying to help," he said. "He's built his company from the ground up, just like you're doing." "The difference is, I'm still building mine," I pointed out. "And I need autonomy to do it my way." Mark kissed my forehead. "Of course you do. I'll talk to him." 2 years into our marriage, Taylor Technologies had grown to 40 employees with clients nationwide. Our data analytics platform was being hailed as revolutionary in industry publications, and tech giants were beginning to take notice. When a major Silicon Valley company approached us with acquisition offers, I declined, despite Harold's strong push to sell. "Jessica, this is the opportunity of a lifetime," he argued during a tense meeting in his office. "They're offering $50 million. You could walk away set for life." "I didn't build this company to sell it," I explained. "Our growth trajectory suggests we'll be worth 3 times that within 5 years. Harold leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. "You know, when Mark first brought you home, I wondered if you had what it takes to succeed in this industry. I underestimated you." The comment was meant as a compliment, but it revealed how he'd viewed me all along, as an unlikely success story, not as a capable entrepreneur in my own right. That night, I raised concerns with Mark about his father's increasing involvement in my company decisions. "I feel like Harold's trying to dictate my business strategy," I told him. "He keeps pushing me to take the acquisition offer." Mark's response surprised me. "Maybe you should consider it," he said, loosening his tie. $50 million is life-changing money, Jess. We could travel, start a family, live comfortably without the constant pressure." "That's not what I want," I said, shocked he didn't understand. "Taylor Technologies is just getting started. I have plans to expand into healthcare analytics next year." Mark sighed. "I know how driven you are. It's one of the things I love about you. But sometimes I wonder if you're working toward happiness or just more success." His words stung, especially because they echoed sentiments Harold had expressed. For the first time, I felt a disconnect between us, as if Mark couldn't quite see the vision that drove me. As Taylor Technologies continued to grow, so did the subtle power struggles with Harold. He began scheduling board meetings without consulting me, bringing in strategic advisors who coincidentally aligned with his vision for the company. Mark remained supportive in public, but increasingly pressured me in private to compromise more with his father. "He's been doing this for decades, Jess," Mark would say. "His experience is invaluable. Why fight it?" I didn't want to fight, but I also couldn't surrender control of my company to someone with fundamentally different values. Harold prioritized short-term profits over sustainable growth, immediate returns over innovation. We clashed frequently about resource allocation, with Harold pushing to cut our R&D budget while I argued for increased investment in new technologies. The strain began affecting our marriage. Mark and I argued more frequently, often about his father's role in the company. "You knew we'd be working with my family when you agreed to let Wilson and Associates handle the business side," he reminded me during one heated exchange. "Handle the business side, yes. Not dictate the company's entire direction," I countered. "This is still Taylor Technologies, not Wilson Technologies." Mark's face hardened. "Maybe that's the problem. You're so focused on keeping it your company that you forget we're supposed to be building a life together." His words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what my company meant to me. It wasn't about ego or ownership. It was about creating technology that could genuinely improve how businesses operated. It was about seeing my vision realized according to my values, not compromised for expedience or profit margins. Our third anniversary passed with subdued celebration. Mark gave me a beautiful diamond bracelet, but the romantic dinner was interrupted by 3 calls from Harold about a potential investor. I found myself increasingly torn between my roles as wife and CEO, feeling I couldn't fully satisfy either. The breaking point came unexpectedly. My grandmother Rose, who had raised me after my parents died, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Rose had been my rock, the person who bought me my first computer, who encouraged me to pursue my dreams, even when they seemed impossible. Her death devastated me. The funeral was small, attended mostly by a few of Rose's friends and neighbors. The Wilsons came, standing awkwardly among the modest gathering, clearly uncomfortable in the small chapel. Rose had left me her modest savings, about $180,000, and her collection of vintage jewelry, including pieces from my mother and grandmother. She would have wanted you to have something to remember her by, the executor explained, handing me a velvet pouch containing my mother's sapphire pendant and my grandmother's pearl earrings. These weren't particularly valuable pieces in monetary terms, but their sentimental worth was immeasurable. In the weeks following Rose's death, I found myself retreating into work, finding solace in code when emotions became overwhelming. Marx tried to be supportive but seemed increasingly distant, spending more time at his father's office and less at home. When I asked about his absences, he cited work pressures and family obligations. 3 months after Rose's funeral, I discovered the truth. I was searching our home office for tax documents when I found a folder labeled Henderson Acquisition hidden behind Mark's files. Taylor Technologies had been considering acquiring Henderson Systems, a smaller analytics company with complementary technology, but Harold had strongly opposed the move. Curious about Mark's private documentation on the deal, I opened the folder. Inside wasn't information about Henderson Systems, but documents regarding my inheritance from Rose. Bank statements showed the funds had been transferred not to my personal account as instructed, but to a Wilson & Associates investment account. A sticky note in Mark's handwriting read, "Transfer RT inheritance to Specialized Growth Fund. Discuss with Dad." My heart pounding, I dug deeper, uncovering more folders with more damning information. Legal documents showed that when Taylor Technologies was incorporated, Harold had structured it with a complex ownership arrangement. While I was listed as founder and CEO, the majority of voting shares were distributed among various Wilson family holdings. My actual ownership stake was just 32%, not enough for controlling interest. Another document outlined a planned restructuring of Taylor Technologies, scheduled to take effect the following month. I would be moved to Chief Technology Officer, focused solely on development, while Harold would assume the role of Executive Chairman with Mark as President. My breath caught as I read the justification. JT lacks necessary business acumen for company's next growth phase. Transition to specialized technical role better utilizes her capabilities while protecting Wilson family investments. The final betrayal was a prenuptial agreement amendment I had supposedly signed 6 months earlier, waiving rights to certain company assets in the event of divorce. The signature looked like mine, but I had no recollection of ever seeing the document, let alone signing it. The room seemed to spin as the full scope of the deception came into focus. This wasn't recent opportunism. This was a long-term strategy that had likely been in place since Harold first took interest in my company. Perhaps even since Mark had first approached me at that tech conference. I heard the front door open and close. Mark was home. Quickly, I photographed key documents with my phone before returning everything to its place. When Mark entered the Ike's office, I was innocently organizing tax paperwork. "Working late again?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Just getting organized," I replied, amazed at how steady my voice sounded despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "How was your day?" "Productive. Dad and I finalized some details on the Henderson acquisition. I think you'll be pleased." The casual lie confirmed everything. There was no point confronting him yet, not until I had developed a strategy. So I smiled and nodded, playing the role of unsuspecting wife while my mind raced through implications and options. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I made a decision. I would not be pushed out of my own company. I would not watch my life's work be commandeered by Harold Wilson's empire. and I would not remain in a marriage built on deception. The next morning, I called in sick to the office for the first time since founding the company. As soon as Mark left for work, I began my counteroffensive, starting with a call to Diane Zhang, a corporate attorney I'd met through a Women in Tech mentorship program. "Jessica, this sounds like a serious situation," Diane said after I explained the documents I'd found. "Before we proceed, I need to see everything. Can you get copies without raising suspicions?" "I've already photographed the key documents," I told her. "I'll send them now." While Diane reviewed the evidence, I began my own investigation. The first step was understanding exactly how Harold had restructured my company ownership. Using my developer credentials, I accessed the company's legal database, downloading incorporation papers, amendments, and board minutes from the past 3 years. What I found was both infuriating and illuminating. Harold had methodically diluted my effective control through a series of seemingly innocuous maneuvers, issuing new share classes, restructuring voting rights, creating management trusts. Each change had been presented to me as standard business procedure, often buried in stacks of documents requiring signatures. I'd trusted Mark and his family, focusing on product development while they quietly commandeered my company. However, Harold had made one critical mistake. During incorporation, Taylor Technologies had been registered with dual-class shares, Class A with voting rights and Class B with economic rights but limited voting power. As the original founder, I held 100% of the Class A shares, while subsequent investments primarily received Class B shares. This structure had been Harold's idea originally, a way to attract investment while protecting my founder control. In reality, he'd been systematically manipulating the Class B shares, consolidating them under Wilson family control while leaving my Class A shares untouched. He likely assumed these founder shares were a minority interest, not realizing their special voting provisions. I called Diane with this discovery. The incorporation document includes a supermajority provision for Class A shares on matters of company control, I explained. If I'm reading this correctly, I can block any leadership change with my founder shares. "Let me check," Diane said, papers rustling in the background. "Yes, here it is. Article 5, Section 3, any modification to the executive structure requires approval from 75% of Class A shareholders, which is just you. They can own 99% of the company, but they can't remove you as CEO without your consent." A plan began forming in my mind. What about the inheritance funds they diverted? And my grandmother's jewelry? "That's straightforward fraud and conversion," Diane replied. "Especially if you never authorize the transfer. We can file for immediate recovery, plus damages." By evening, we had outlined a strategy. First, secure my position as CEO by leveraging the Class A shares supermajority provision. Second, recover my inheritance through legal channels. Third, document every instance of financial impropriety for potential legal action. "What about your marriage?" Diane asked gently. "These actions will likely trigger a divorce." "The marriage is already over," I replied, surprised at how little pain the admission caused. "I'm just making it official." Over the next week, I maintained a perfect facade. I attended meetings, worked on development projects, and smiled through family dinners at the Wilson mansion. Meanwhile, Diane and I prepared the necessary legal documents and gathered evidence. I discovered that Harold had transferred my inheritance not to a growth fund as Mark's note suggested, but directly to a trust benefiting Natalie Parker, Mark's assistant who, according to email records I uncovered, he'd been seeing romantically for at least 8 months. The trust documentation explicitly identified the funds as gift from Harold Wilson, rather than my inherited assets. Even more disturbing, I found emails discussing my grandmother's jewelry collection, which had mysteriously disappeared from our safe deposit box. Photos attached to one email showed Natalie wearing my mother's sapphire pendant at a private dinner with Mark and his parents. These discoveries should have broken my heart. Instead, they hardened my resolve. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. The Henderson acquisition provided the perfect opportunity. Taylor Technologies had been negotiating to purchase this smaller analytics company for months, with Harold repeatedly delaying the deal. Now I understood why. He wanted to wait until after the planned leadership restructuring, so he and Mark would get credit for the expansion. I accelerated the timeline, working directly with Henderson's CEO to finalize terms. When Harold discovered my actions, he called an emergency board meeting, exactly as I'd anticipated. "This acquisition discussion is premature," Harold announced to the gathered board members. "Jessica has overstepped her authority by advancing negotiations without proper board approval." I smiled pleasantly. "Actually, Harold, as CEO, I'm well within my authority to explore acquisition opportunities. I've merely brought it to the final stage for board approval." "Which is exactly the problem," Harold continued, his confidence unwavering. "The board feels that major strategic decisions should involve more oversight, which brings us to the next agenda item." He nodded to his assistant, who distributed folders to everyone present. "We're proposing an executive restructuring to better position Taylor Technologies for its next growth phase. Jessica would transition to Chief Technology Officer, focusing on what she does best, product development, while Mark would assume the president role, and I would serve as executive chairman." The other board members, mostly Harold's associates, nodded in agreement. This was clearly not news to them. This transition would take effect immediately following today's vote. Harold continued, already sounding victorious. "Jessica, we value your technical contributions enormously, but the company needs experienced business leadership to scale properly." I waited until he finished before responding. "That's an interesting proposal, Harold. Before we vote, I'd like to distribute some information of my own." I handed out my own folders, containing copies of the original incorporation documents highlighting the Class A supermajority provision, along with a legal opinion from Diane's firm. "As the sole holder of Class A shares, I have exclusive rights to approve any change to the executive structure," I explained calmly. "This provision was included in our original incorporation, which your firm handled, if you recall." Harold's face flushed as he flipped through the documents. "This is a technicality that—" "Additionally," I continued, "I've prepared documentation regarding certain financial irregularities that have recently come to my attention. I distributed a second set of documents detailing the misappropriation of my inheritance funds, including bank transfers and trust documentation naming Natalie Parker as beneficiary. My inheritance from my grandmother was illegally diverted to a trust benefiting Ms. Parker," I said, watching Harold's face drain of color. "I've already filed a complaint with the Colorado Banking Commission and the District Attorney's Office." Mark burst in. "Jessica, this is ridiculous. That money was invested for your benefit." "In a trust explicitly naming Natalie as the beneficiary?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting definition of my benefit, especially considering your relationship with her." The boardroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Harold recovered first, attempting to regain control of the meeting. "These personal matters are irrelevant to today's agenda," he said dismissively. "Let's return to the restructuring proposal." "Actually, they're highly relevant," I corrected him, "as they demonstrate a pattern of financial mismanagement and ethical misconduct that directly impacts this company. Which brings me to my own proposal." I distributed a third set of documents, my counteroffer for the company restructuring. I propose that Harold Wilson steps down from all involvement with Taylor Technologies, effective immediately. Marquis Wilson will be transitioned to a non-executive role. The Henderson acquisition will proceed as negotiated, and I will continue as CEO with expanded powers. Harold's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "This is absurd. The Wilson family effectively controls this company. We've invested millions." "And you'll retain your economic interest," I assured him. "You just won't control my company anymore. Your choice is simple. Accept these terms, or I'll take the evidence of financial fraud, including the misappropriation of my inheritance, to the authorities. I imagine Wilson and Associates' reputation might suffer if clients learned about these activities. The room fell silent again. Harold stared at me with a mixture of anger and, was that respect? Mark looked shell-shocked, as if he couldn't believe his carefully constructed world was collapsing. You wouldn't, Harold finally said. It would damage Taylor Technologies too. I built this company from nothing, I replied. If necessary, I can do it again. The question is whether your reputation can survive a public fraud investigation. After tense negotiation, Harold agreed to my terms. He would step down from all involvement with Taylor Technologies while maintaining the Wilson family's economic interest as passive investors. Mark would receive a generous severance package, but no ongoing role. The Henderson acquisition would proceed as planned. As we prepared to sign the final agreement 3 days later, I added one more condition. Sign here, and the Henderson acquisition will be complete, I said, sliding the contract across the polished mahogany table to Harold. His eyes darted nervously between me and Mark, who stood with his arm around his new wife, Natalie. The boardroom fell silent as Harold's trembling hand reached for the pen. By the way, I added casually, that inheritance fund you redirected to Natalie last month? Those were company shares. My company shares. Harold's face drained of color as the realization hit him. Behind him, Mark's confident smirk dissolved into confusion. Natalie's hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching the diamond pendant Harold had given her from my grandmother's collection. Congratulations on your recent promotion to regional manager, Natalie, I continued, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions in my chest. As of today, you report directly to me. I stood, smoothing my blazer. Welcome to Taylor Technologies, my company. The morning after my grandmother Rose's funeral, I woke before dawn, the weight of grief pressing against my chest. The bed beside me was empty. Mark had already left for an early meeting at his father's firm. As I made coffee in our silent kitchen, I tried to process everything that had happened in the past week. Rose had been my only real family since I was 12. After my parents died in a car accident, she had taken me in without question, creating a home filled with unconditional love and unwavering support. You're meant for something special, Jessica, she would tell me as I hunched over computer, parts scattered across her dining room table. While other grandmothers worried about their teenage granddaughters' social lives, Rose worried I wasn't challenging myself enough academically. She worked extra shifts as a nurse to buy me the programming, books I coveted, sat through countless explanations of coding concepts she didn't understand but wanted to support. Our last conversation kept replaying in my mind. We had talked about Taylor Technologies' expansion plans, and Rose had expressed concern about Harold's increasing involvement. Just make sure you're not giving away what you've built, she had cautioned. I've seen how that family looks at you, like you're a novelty, not a peer. I had defended the Wilsons then, attributing Rose's concerns to her natural protectiveness. Now, standing in my designer kitchen in the Cherry Creek house Mark and I had bought after our wedding, I wondered if she had seen something I'd been too blinded by success and acceptance to notice. The executor of Rose's will had been apologetic about the modest size of my inheritance. She wanted to leave you more, he explained, but her medical expenses these past few years. I had stopped him, explaining that money had never defined our relationship. The $180,000 she had managed to save was far more than I expected, and the jewelry, especially my mother's sapphire pendant and my grandmother's pearl earrings, were priceless to me because of their sentimental value. I had planned to use Rose's savings to establish a scholarship for young women in technology, honoring her belief in education as the path to independence. When I shared this idea with Mark, his response had been oddly hesitant. That's a lovely thought, but shouldn't we discuss financial decisions of this size together? those funds could be invested much more efficiently. His reaction had struck me as uncharacteristic. Mark had always supported my philanthropic initiatives before. But grief had clouded my judgment, and I hadn't pursued the conversation further. My coffee had grown cold as these memories washed over me. Glancing at the clock, I realized I was running late for a meeting with our development team. Taylor Technologies was in the final testing phase for our healthcare analytics module, an expansion that would potentially double our market reach. Despite my personal loss, the company needed me present and focused. The modern glass and steel building that housed both Taylor Technologies and Wilson & Associates gleamed in the morning sunlight as I pulled into my reserved parking space. I had initially been thrilled when Harold suggested moving my company into their building. It had seemed like a vote of confidence, a sign of respect. Now, walking through the lobby where Wilson & Associates occupied the top 3 floors while Taylor Technologies operated from the 4th, the symbolism wasn't lost on me. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," the security guard greeted me. Despite 3 years of marriage and my professional success, I was still identified primarily as Mark's wife in many contexts, especially those connected to the Wilson family. "It's Ms. Taylor professionally, Rick," I corrected gently, as I did at least once. "A week. How's your daughter doing with those coding classes?" Rick's face lit up. "She's loving them. Thanks again for the scholarship recommendation. She wouldn't have had this opportunity otherwise." I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. The mentorship program I'd established for underrepresented groups in tech was perhaps the achievement I was most proud of, more than the profitable contracts or industry awards. Creating opportunities for others like the ones I'd fought so hard for myself felt like meaningful success. The elevator doors opened directly into Taylor Technologies' reception area, where our logo, a stylized TT in blue and silver, adorned the wall. Alicia, our head of operations, was waiting for me with a concerned expression. "I'm so sorry about your grandmother," she said, giving me a quick hug. Alicia had been my second hire, a brilliant systems architect who had become a trusted friend. "Nobody expected you in today. The team would understand if you took time off." "Work helps," I said simply. "What's our status on the Henderson Systems acquisition research?" Alicia hesitated, glancing toward my office. "Harold called an executive meeting about that yesterday. He said you were taking personal time and asked me to brief him instead." A flicker of irritation ran through me. Harold had no official position at Taylor Technologies beyond being our financial advisor through Wilson & Associates. He had no authority to call executive meetings in my absence. "What was discussed?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral as we walked toward my office. "He thinks the acquisition is premature. His recommendation is to hold off until next quarter at minimum." Alicia's tone made it clear she was merely reporting information, not endorsing it. "And what do you think?" I asked, valuing her insight. "Henderson's patient outcome prediction model would integrate perfectly with our platform. Their team is solid, their financials are clean, and their corporate culture seems compatible. We've been exploring this for months. I don't see any business reason to delay." I nodded, unsurprised by her assessment. "That matches my thinking. Schedule a follow-up meeting with the Henderson team for early next week. We're moving forward unless there's a legitimate reason not to." As Alicia turned to leave, I added, "And Alicia. In the future, if Harold calls meetings about Taylor Technologies' business in my absence, please inform him that executive decisions require my input." She smiled slightly. "Gladly." Alone in my office, I reviewed the Henderson acquisition materials we'd been compiling for months. Their technology complemented ours perfectly, and their company culture emphasized innovation and ethical data handling, values central to Taylor Technologies' mission. The financial projections showed the acquisition would be profitable within 18 months, and combining our technologies would accelerate our healthcare analytics platform by at least a year. Harold's opposition made no sense from a business perspective, unless, of course, his priorities weren't aligned with Taylor Technologies' best interests. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Harold Wilson stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. At 65, he remained physically impressive, tall and broad-shouldered with the confident bearing of someone who expected the world to accommodate him. "Jessica, I didn't expect to see you in today," he said, his tone suggesting concern while his eyes assessed me carefully. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, thank you," I replied, gesturing for him to enter. "Alicia mentioned you held a meeting about the Henderson acquisition yesterday." Harold settled into the chair across from my desk. "Just preliminary discussions? I didn't want to burden you with business matters during your time of grief. I appreciate the thought, but as CEO, I need to be involved in strategic decisions even during personal difficulties." I kept my tone professional, though his presumption rankled. Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Mark and I simply thought we could lighten your load temporarily." Mark. So my husband had been involved in this meeting as well, despite telling me he had client appointments all day. Another small deception among what I was beginning to suspect were many. "What concerns do you have about the Henderson acquisition?" I asked directly. Harold launched into a detailed critique that sounded reasonable on the surface. Concerns about integration timelines, potential culture clashes, cash flow implications. But none of these issues were new, and all had been addressed in our planning. "These are all valid considerations that we've already evaluated extensively," I noted when he finished. "The acquisition still projects as net positive across all metrics. Unless there's something else?" Harold leaned forward, his demeanor shifting subtly. "Jessica, you've built an impressive company, especially for someone so young. But acquisitions are complex territory. The Wilsons have been handling business mergers since before you were born." There it was, the condescension carefully wrapped, in compliments that had become increasingly common in our interactions. 3 years ago, I might have second-guessed myself, deferring to his experience. Now, with 40 employees depending on my leadership and clients trusting our solutions to make critical business decisions, I knew better. "Then you understand that timing is critical in tech acquisitions," I replied evenly. "Henderson has proprietary algorithms that would take us years to develop independently. Their team is awaiting our decision, and competitors are circling. I've analyzed this opportunity thoroughly, and I'm moving forward." Harold's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "At least wait until after the quarterly board meeting next month. Give us time to present alternatives." "The board has already received the acquisition briefing materials," I reminded him. "Unless there's a specific reason you haven't shared. For this delay, we're proceeding with the next phase of negotiations." Harold stood, straightening his bespoke suit jacket. "I see you've made up your mind. I hope you're not allowing emotional decisions in the wake of your loss to cloud your business judgment." The subtle manipulation, suggesting my grief was impairing my professional capabilities, was so skillfully deployed that I almost doubted myself for a moment. Almost. "My grandmother taught me to recognize the difference between people who want to help me succeed and those who want to control my success," I said, standing as well. "I've always valued your business insights, Harold. I hope I can continue to do so." He nodded stiffly before departing, leaving me to wonder what was really behind his opposition to an acquisition that so clearly benefited Taylor Technologies. That evening, I arrived home to find Mark cooking dinner, a rare occurrence that immediately put me on alert. The kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary, and a bottle of my favorite Pinot Noir was breathing on the counter. "You didn't need to do this," I said, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "I wanted to," Mark replied, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You've been through a lot, and I haven't been as supportive as I should be." I took a sip of wine, studying my husband over the rim of the glass. Mark had always been handsome in the classic, privileged way of men born into wealth. Strong jaw, confident posture, clothes that fit perfectly because they were made for him. When we first met, I had found his self-assurance attractive. Now I wondered how much of it was merely entitlement. "Dad mentioned he spoke with you about Henderson," Mark said casually, stirring the risotto. "He's just concerned about the timing." So this dinner was about business, not grief. "The timing has never been better," I countered. "Their technology complements ours perfectly, their valuation is reasonable, and they're eager to join forces." "What's the real issue, Mark?" He looked uncomfortable, confirming my suspicion that something remained unsaid. "It's just a significant financial commitment. Dad thinks we should consider other investment priorities first." "Such as?" I pressed. Mark hesitated. "Wilson and Associates is launching a new venture capital fund focused on fintech. They're looking for anchor investments, and Dad thought Taylor Technologies might be interested." The pieces clicked into place. "So your father wants us to delay our strategic acquisition, one we've been planning for months, to invest in his new fund instead?" "It would strengthen the relationship between our companies," Mark argued. "Dad's fund would give Taylor Technologies access to emerging fintech innovations. Think of the potential synergies. Think of the conflict of interest," I countered. "Harold is our financial advisor. He should be recommending what's best for Taylor Technologies, not what benefits Wilson and Associates." Mark's expression hardened slightly. "The Wilsons have supported Taylor Technologies from the beginning. Without Dad's connections and investment advice, you might still be coding in our spare bedroom." The comment stung precisely because it contained a partial truth. Harold's network had opened doors, and Wilson and Associates' financial guidance had helped navigate early growth challenges. But Taylor Technologies had succeeded primarily because our products were revolutionary, our team was exceptional, and our execution was flawless. These facts seemed increasingly forgotten in the Wilson family narrative. "I appreciate everything your family has done," I said carefully, "but business decisions need to be based on what's best for Taylor Technologies, not on family obligations or divided loyalties." Dinner was tense after that, our conversation shifting to safer topics that neither of us actually cared about. As Mark loaded the dishwasher later, he mentioned casually, "By the way, I took care of transferring your grandmother's savings to our investment account. The executor sent the check last week." I froze. "I never authorized that. Those funds are meant for the scholarship I'm establishing in Rose's name." Mark looked genuinely confused. "But we discussed this. You agreed it made more sense to invest the money properly rather than giving it away." "No, Mark. I told you my plans for a scholarship, and you suggested investing instead. I never agreed to that." He dried his hands slowly, his expression shifting to one I recognized from business negotiations, reasonable, slightly patronizing. "Jess, you've been under tremendous stress. Memory can be unreliable during grief. We definitely agreed the funds would be better managed through Dad's firm. It's already been processed." For a moment, I doubted myself. Had I agreed during those foggy days after Rose's death? No. This was a deliberate manipulation, gaslighting me about a conversation that had never happened. "Where exactly were the funds transferred?" I asked, my voice steady despite my rising anger. "A specialized growth fund Dad manages. It's performing exceptionally well, 22% returns last quarter. Your grandmother's money will grow much faster there than in some scholarship fund. It's not about returns, Mark. It's about honoring Rose's memory and her values, and it wasn't your decision to make." Mark's facade of patience slipped slightly. "We're married, Jessica. Financial decisions should be made together. Dad and Tiao. I were trying to help you make the smart choice when you're too emotional to see clearly." There it was again, the suggestion that my grief rendered me incapable of making sound decisions. that the Wilson men needed to step in and manage things for my own good. It was patronizing, manipulative, and suddenly, sickeningly familiar. "I want the transfer reversed," I said firmly. "Tomorrow." "That's not possible. The funds are already allocated." "Then unallocate them. That money belongs to a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name, not some Wilson investment pool." Mark sighed heavily. "I'll talk to Dad, but these things take time. Just trust that we're handling your inheritance responsibly." My inheritance. Not our money, not a joint asset, but specifically my inheritance that they had redirected without my knowledge or consent. A cold suspicion began forming in my mind. And my grandmother's jewelry? Is that being handled responsibly too? Mark's slight hesitation told me everything. "It's in the safe deposit box at Dad's bank. More secure than keeping it here." Another decision made without my input, another boundary crossed. Whatever trust remained between us was rapidly disintegrating. The next morning, I called Wilson and Associates Private Banking Division, where our safe deposit box was located. The representative who answered was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but according to our records, that box was accessed and emptied last week by Mr. Mark Wilson. He had the proper authorization as a cosigner on the account." My heart sank. The sapphire pendant that had belonged to my mother, the pearl earrings my grandmother had worn at her wedding, family treasures with minimal financial value but immeasurable sentimental worth, were gone. When confronted that evening, Mark claimed he had moved the jewelry to his father's more secure vault temporarily. "With all the break-ins in the neighborhood lately, it seemed prudent," he explained, though I hadn't heard of any such crimes in our upscale area. "I want them back, Mark. Tomorrow." "Of course," he agreed quickly. "I'll bring everything home this week." But a week passed, then another, with various excuses for the delay. Something was very wrong in my marriage, and the manipulation extended beyond personal boundaries into my company's affairs. Over the following weeks, I began noticing more inconsistencies. Board meeting agendas were changed without my knowledge. Financial reports included projections I hadn't approved. Harold appeared at client meetings uninvited, often contradicting my strategic vision with his own. Most concerning was the gradual shift in how I was presented to the outside world. At industry events, Harold increasingly introduced me as our technical genius rather than as founder and CEO. In press releases, my role was subtly diminished, with more prominence given to Wilson and Associates guidance. It was as if a slow-motion coup was underway, with my company and identity being methodically erased and absorbed into the Wilson family enterprise. I needed to understand exactly what was happening legally with my company and my inheritance. Without alerting Mark or his family, I scheduled a meeting with Diane Zhang, a corporate attorney I had met through a Women in Tech mentorship program. Diane specialized in intellectual property and corporate governance, exactly the expertise I needed. "Based on what you've described, I'm concerned about several issues," Diane said after I explained the situation. "The redistribution of your inheritance without documented consent, the removal of heirloom jewelry from joint storage, and the potential corporate governance irregularities all warrant investigation. But first, I need to understand the exact legal structure of Taylor Technologies and your marriage." I provided Diane with copies of our incorporation documents, investment agreements, and marriage license. "Mark and I signed a prenuptial agreement before our wedding," I added. "Harold insisted, actually. At the time, I didn't mind. I wanted to protect Taylor Technologies in case our marriage didn't work out." Diane made notes as we talked. "Do you have a copy of the prenup?" "In my home office. I'll send it to you tomorrow." "And regarding your inheritance, was there any documentation of your consent for these funds to be transferred to Wilson and Associates management?" "None," I confirmed. "The conversation Mark claims we had never happened." Diane's expression grew serious. "Jessica, Based on what you've shared, I'm concerned this might not be simple miscommunication or overzealous family involvement. This pattern suggests a deliberate attempt to gain control of your assets and company. I recommend we conduct a thorough review of all documents related to Taylor Technologies and your personal finances. Her assessment aligned with my growing suspicions, but hearing it stated so plainly sent a chill through me. What should I do in the meantime? Document everything, Diane advised. Any conversations about your company or finances, keep detailed notes with dates and participants. Don't sign anything without legal review. And most importantly, be careful about what you reveal to Mark or Harold about your concerns. That evening, I searched our home office for the prenuptial agreement, eventually finding it in Mark's filing cabinet. As I reviewed the document, everything appeared as I remembered. Clear protection for Taylor Technologies as my separate property, provisions for division of joint assets, nothing unusual. But as I went to return the file, something caught my attention. A folder labeled Henderson Acquisition, hidden behind other documents. Taylor Technologies had been considering acquiring Henderson Systems for months, with Harold repeatedly opposing the move. Why would Mark have private documentation on the deal? Opening the folder, I found not information about Henderson Systems, but documents regarding my inheritance from Rose. Bank statements showed the funds had been transferred not to a generic growth fund as Mark had claimed, but to a trust with a beneficiary name that made my blood run cold, Natalie Parker. Natalie worked as Mark's executive assistant at Wilson & Associates. I had met her several times at company functions, a poised, attractive woman in her early 30s, who always seemed excessively deferential to the Wilson family. I had noticed nothing unusual in her interactions with Mark, but this document suggested a relationship far beyond professional. My hands trembling, I photographed the trust documentation with my phone before continuing my search. The next folder contained even more damning information, emails between Mark and his father discussing Taylor Technologies' ownership structure, with references to diluting JT's effective control and transitioning leadership post-restructuring. Another document outlined a planned corporate reorganization scheduled to take effect after the next board meeting. I would be moved to Chief Technology Officer, focused solely on product development, while Harold would assume the role of Executive Chairman with Mark as President. The justification made me physically ill. JT lacks necessary business acumen for company's next growth phase. Transition to specialized technical role better utilizes her capabilities while protecting Wilson family investments. The final betrayal was an amendment to our prenuptial agreement I had supposedly signed 6 months earlier. This document substantially modified the original terms, waiving rights to certain company assets and intellectual property in the event of divorce. The signature looked like mine, but I had absolutely no recollection of ever seeing this document, let alone signing it. I heard the front door open, Mark returning from work. Quickly, I photographed the remaining documents before carefully returning everything to its original location. By the time Mark entered the home office, I was innocently organizing tax papers at my desk. "Working late?" he asked casually, loosening his tie. "Just getting organized," I replied, amazed at how normal my voice sounded despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. "How was your day?" "Productive. Dad and I made some headway on the Henderson acquisition review. I think you'll be pleased with the direction we're considering." The casual lie told me everything I needed to know. There was no legitimate Henderson acquisition review, only a smokescreen for their real plans. My marriage, like my company, had been built on deception. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I made my decision. I would not be pushed out of my own company. I would not watch my life's work be commandeered by Harold Wilson's empire. And I would not remain in a marriage built on lies. The next morning, I called in sick to the office for the first time since founding the company. As soon as Mark left for work, I began implementing my counter strategy. The first step was sending Diane all the evidence I had gathered, along with a clear directive: protect my company and recover my inheritance by any legal means necessary. Based on these documents, we have multiple causes of action, Diane confirmed after reviewing everything. Financial fraud regarding your inheritance, potential forgery of the prenup amendment, corporate governance violations. But Jessica, you should know. Pursuing these claims will almost certainly end your marriage and create significant professional conflict with Wilson and Associates. I understand, I replied, a strange calm settling over me. But I won't let them take what I've built. Over the next week, I maintained a perfect facade at home and work. I attended meetings, continued product development work, and smiled through family dinners at the Wilson mansion. No one, not Mark, not Harold, not anyone at Taylor Technologies, suspected I was aware of their plans or taking steps to counter them. Meanwhile, Diane and her team worked diligently to verify my legal position and prepare countermeasures. The most crucial discovery came from a detailed review of Taylor Technologies' incorporation documents. During the initial setup, Harold had structured the company with dual-class shares, Class A with superior voting rights, and Class B with economic rights but limited voting power. As the founder, I held 100% of the Class A shares, while subsequent investments primarily received Class B shares. This is actually quite common in tech startups, Diane explained. It allows founders to maintain control even as they raise capital. What's interesting is that Harold set up this structure himself, presumably to protect your control initially, before the Wilsons began accumulating ownership through various means. And now? I asked. The Wilsons control approximately 68% of the total equity through various holdings, but you still hold all Class A shares, which carry special voting rights on certain governance matters, including executive appointments. It was the leverage I needed, a protective measure Harold himself had created, likely never expecting it would be used against his family's interests. The board meeting scheduled for the following week would be the battleground. According to the documents I had discovered, Harold planned to use this meeting to implement the leadership restructuring that would effectively sideline me and my own company. But now I had a counterattack prepared, one that would not only preserve my position, but expose the Wilsons' manipulations. As I refined my strategy with Diane, another disturbing discovery emerged. The trust benefiting Natalie Parker wasn't just receiving my inheritance funds, it was also accumulating Taylor Technologies stock purchased with those funds. Harold had essentially used my grandmother's money to buy company shares for his son's mistress. The betrayal was so multi-layered, so calculated, that it transformed my hurt into cold determination. This wasn't just about saving my company anymore. It was about justice. 3 days before the board meeting, Harold requested a private lunch to discuss company strategy. I accepted, curious to see if he would reveal any part of his plans directly. We met at Barolo Grill, an upscale Italian restaurant frequented by Denver's business elite. Harold had reserved a secluded corner table, affording privacy for our conversation. He ordered an expensive bottle of Brunello without consulting me, then spent the first 20 minutes sharing anecdotes about his early business ventures, positioning himself as the mentor and me as the grateful protégé. "Jessica," he finally said, swirling the wine in his glass, "I've been meaning to discuss Taylor Technologies' future leadership structure with you privately, before the board meeting." "I'm listening," I replied neutrally. "The company has reached a critical juncture. Your technical vision has created something remarkable, but the next growth phase requires different skills." He leaned forward, his tone confidential yet authoritative. "The board and I believe a restructuring would best serve everyone's interests. You would transition to Chief Technology Officer, focusing exclusively on product development, your true passion and genius." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this proposal for the first time. "And who would take over as CEO?" "Marks would assume the president role, handling day-to-day operations, while I would serve as executive chairman, guiding overall strategy and investor relations. I see, I said carefully. And this transition, it's being proposed because you believe I lack the business acumen to lead Taylor Technologies forward? Harold's expression flickered briefly with surprise that I had articulated the unspoken criticism so directly. Not at all, he backpedaled smoothly. It's about optimizing everyone's strengths. You're a brilliant innovator, Jessica. But running a major corporation requires different capabilities. Experience Mark and I bring to the table. Experience in what specifically, Harold? Our revenue has grown 300% under my leadership. Our client retention rate is 96%, nearly unheard of in the tech sector. Our workplace has been rated among the top 10 for diversity and inclusion in Colorado tech. Which of these metrics suggest I'm failing as CEO? Harold's smile tightened. Business isn't just about metrics. It's about relationships, strategic vision, knowing when to pivot. The Wilsons have built successful companies for generations. We know what it takes to create lasting value. Is that what this is about? Creating lasting value or controlling it? His eyes narrowed slightly. I'm not sure I appreciate your tone, Jessica. The Wilson family has supported you from the beginning. Without our backing, Taylor Technologies might still be a concept on your laptop. There it was again. The subtle dismissal of my achievements, the implication that my success was primarily due to their beneficence rather than my own capabilities. It was a narrative they had cultivated carefully over years, and one I had unconsciously begun to accept. Your family's support has been valuable, I acknowledged. But Taylor Technologies succeeded because our products are revolutionary and our execution exceptional. Those are achievements your proposed restructuring seems to dismiss rather than build upon. Harold's facade of mentorship slipped, revealing a flash of the calculating businessman beneath. The board vote is largely procedural at this point, Jessica. The decision has effectively been made. I'm offering you the courtesy of this conversation so you can process the change privately, rather than being blindsided at the meeting. I met his gaze steadily. I appreciate the heads up. But as the holder of all Class A shares, I should remind you that any executive restructuring requires my approval under Article 5, Section 3 of our incorporation documents. The momentary widening of Harold's eyes confirmed my suspicion. He had either forgotten this provision or assumed I was unaware of it. Legal technicalities aside, he recovered quickly. This transition is in everyone's best interest, including yours. Fighting it would create unnecessary tension within the company and family. I smiled slightly. Speaking of family interests, I've been meaning to ask about my grandmother's jewelry. Mark mentioned it was moved to your secure vault, but I'd like it returned. The abrupt change of subject caught Harold off guard. I believe Mark is handling that matter. And my inheritance funds? The ones transferred to that specialized growth fund you manage? I'd like documentation on how those are being invested. Harold's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Financial matters are best discussed with Mark. I don't involve myself in your personal finances. Interesting, since the trust documentation lists you as the trustee, with Natalie Parker as beneficiary. I kept my tone conversational, as if discussing the restaurant's wine selection rather than exposing his fraud. Harold set down his wine glass carefully. I'm not sure where you're getting your information, Jessica, but there seems to be some confusion. No confusion, Harold. Just clarity about my company, my marriage, and the systematic deception orchestrated by the Wilson family. I look forward to discussing it all at the board meeting. I stood, placing my napkin beside my barely touched meal. Thank you for lunch. It was truly illuminating. As I walked out of the restaurant, leaving Harold stunned at the table, I felt a strange combination of grief and liberation. The family I had married into, the business relationship I had trusted, the husband I had loved, All were built on calculated manipulation. But in 3 days, at the board meeting, I would reclaim everything they had attempted to take from me. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the balcony of our Cherry Creek home, watching the distant lights of downtown Denver shimmer against the night sky. From this hilltop vantage point, the city seemed peaceful, orderly, each light representing someone's life unfolding in predictable patterns. My own life had lost all semblance of predictability. In less than 24 hours, I would either reclaim what was rightfully mine or lose everything I had built. Mark was working late again, or so he claimed. I suspected he was finalizing strategies with Harold for tomorrow's ambush. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Final documents ready. All systems go for tomorrow. Get some rest. Rest seemed impossible with adrenaline coursing through my veins, my mind constantly replaying scenarios for the coming confrontation. I wrapped my cardigan tighter against the Colorado night chill, thinking of Rose. She had always admired fighters, people who stood their ground when it mattered. There's a difference between stubbornness and conviction, she'd tell me. Stubbornness is about ego. Conviction is about values. Tomorrow would test not just my legal strategy, but my conviction about what Taylor Technologies represented and the kind of leader I wanted to be. The sound of a car pulling into our driveway interrupted my thoughts. Mark was home earlier than expected. I watched as he emerged from his Tesla, followed by another figure, Natalie Parker. They stood in the driveway for a moment, speaking intensely before Natalie reached up to straighten Mark's tie. The gesture was casual, intimate, the movement of someone accustomed to touching him. Mark leaned down and kissed her briefly before she returned to her car and drove away. I stepped back from the balcony railing, a strange calm replacing the anxiety that had gripped me for days. No more doubt, no more second-guessing. The final piece of confirmation delivered right to my doorstep. When Mark entered our bedroom, 10 minutes later, I was sitting at my vanity, methodically removing my earrings as if it were any ordinary evening. "You're still up," he observed, loosening his tie, the same tie Natalie had adjusted moments earlier. "Preparing for tomorrow's board meeting," I replied casually. "It seems like it will be eventful." Mark approached, placing his hands on my shoulders in what once would have been a comforting gesture. Now it felt like ownership, possession. "Don't stress about it. Dad and I have everything under control." I met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm sure you do." Something in my tone must have alerted him. His hands tightened slightly on my shoulders. "Is everything okay?" "Just thinking about my grandmother's jewelry," I said. "Particularly my mother's sapphire pendant. I'd really like to have it back." Mark's reflection showed a flicker of discomfort before his expression smoothed. "I told you, I'll get everything from Dad's vault soon. There's just been a lot happening with work." "I understand. Time gets away from us when we're focused on priorities." I stood, turning to face him directly. "Like Natalie Parker, for instance." Mark's face drained of color, but his recovery was impressive. "My assistant? What about her?" "She seems very dedicated to her job. Taking work home, helping with your tie in our driveway at 11 o'clock at night. Going above and beyond. Wouldn't you say?" He froze, calculating his response. I could almost see the lies forming, evaluating which might be believable. "You misunderstood what you saw," he finally said. "Natalie dropped off some documents for tomorrow's meeting. The tie thing was nothing, just being helpful." I nodded as if considering this explanation. "And the kiss? Was that just being helpful too?" Mark's facade cracked. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that suddenly made him look younger, less certain. "Jess, it's not what you think. Things have been difficult between us lately, with your focus on the company, and then your grandmother's death." "Stop," I interrupted, unable to stomach his attempt to blame me for his infidelity. "I'm not interested in justifications, especially..." Not tonight. We both need rest before tomorrow's board meeting. Relief washed over his face at the apparent reprieve. You're right. We should talk about this after the meeting, when things are settled. When things are settled, I agreed. Good night, Mark. I spent the night in our guest room, surrounded by paperwork Diane had prepared. Each document represented a piece of armor I would don for tomorrow's battle. Sleep eventually came in fitful bursts, my dreams filled with boardrooms and betrayals, falling shares and rising voices. Morning arrived with harsh clarity. I dressed with deliberate care, a tailored navy suit that projected authority without being severe, subtle makeup that enhanced rather than concealed, my grandmother's watch my only jewelry, my armor, visible and invisible. Mark had already left when I came downstairs, another sign that today was not business as usual. Typically, we drove together when major meetings were scheduled. His absence confirmed that the Wilsons were coordinating, separately, preparing for what they believed would be my professional execution. The Wilson and Associates building gleamed in the morning sunlight as I pulled into my parking space, its glass exterior reflecting the clear blue Colorado sky. I nodded to Rick at security, took the elevator to Taylor Technologies' floor, and walked directly to my office without engaging with anyone. Focus was essential now. Alicia appeared in my doorway minutes later, her expression concerned. Conference. Room A has been reserved for an executive session before the board meeting. Harold called it. You weren't on the notification list. When? I asked, unsurprised but needing details. Starts in 15 minutes. Full board attendance requested except you. I nodded, checking my watch. Thank you, Alicia. Could you ask Diane Zhang to come up now? She should be in the lobby shortly. Alicia's eyes widened slightly at the mention of my attorney, but she asked no questions. Of course. Alone again, I reviewed my strategy one final time. Diane and I had prepared for multiple scenarios, but human reactions remained unpredictable. Would Harold back down when confronted with evidence of his manipulation? Would Mark choose his father's plan over our marriage when forced to decide? Most importantly, would the independent board members, 2 venture capitalists and a retired tech executive, side with innovation or tradition when presented with both the Wilson scheme and my countermeasures? Diane arrived precisely on time, her calm professionalism steadying my nerves. At 45, she projected the quiet authority of someone who had faced countless corporate battles and emerged victorious more often than not. Ready? She asked simply, placing her briefcase on my conference table. Ready, I confirmed. They're meeting without me right now, preparing the board for the restructuring proposal. Diane smiled slightly. Perfect. Let them get comfortable. Overconfidence makes people careless. We used the remaining time to arrange our documentation in the precise order we would need it. At 9:55, exactly 5 minutes before the official board meeting was scheduled to begin, we headed to conference room A. I could hear Harold's voice through the door, his authoritative tone carrying even through the soundproofed walls. Restructuring represents the natural evolution of Taylor Technologies' leadership. Jessica's technical vision remains vital, but strategic growth requires experienced executive oversight that... I pushed open the door without knocking. 10 heads swiveled toward me. The 7 board members, Mark, Harold, and a corporate attorney from Wilson and Associates, whose presence confirmed this was never intended to be a simple discussion. Good morning, I said pleasantly, noting with satisfaction how Harold's sentence died mid-thought. I see we're discussing Taylor Technologies' future leadership. Perfect timing. Harold recovered quickly, his smile tight. Jessica, we were just wrapping up some preliminary business before the official meeting. This is Richard Cormier, our corporate counsel. I recognize Mr. Cormier, I replied, gesturing to Diane. This is Diane Zhang, my attorney. She'll be joining us today. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Harold's expression darkened while the three independent board members exchanged glances. Mark stared at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. "I wasn't aware legal representation was necessary for today's discussion," Harold said carefully. "Nor was I countered, until I discovered certain documents suggesting today's meeting was intended to remove me from my position as CEO through potentially improper means." The bomb detonated in slow motion. Harold's face remained composed, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the conference table. Mark paled visibly. The independent board members looked between us with increasing alarm. "That's a serious allegation," said Elena Martinez, the retired tech executive who served as our most experienced independent director. "Perhaps we should start the official meeting and address this directly." "I agree," I said, taking my seat, at the head of the table, directly opposite Harold. Diane sat beside me, opening her briefcase with methodical precision. Harold glanced at his attorney, receiving a slight nod before proceeding. "Very well. As chair of the board, I call this meeting to order." Today's primary agenda item concerns executive leadership structure. As I was explaining, the board has received a proposal to optimize Taylor Technologies' leadership by realigning executive roles to better support our growth phase. "Before we proceed," I interrupted, "I'd like to distribute some documents relevant to this discussion." Diane handed out folders to each board member. Harold moved to object, but Elena raised her hand. "Let's review the materials first, then discuss." The room fell silent as everyone examined the contents. I had arranged the documents strategically. First, the incorporation papers highlighting the Class A share provisions that gave me final approval over executive changes. Second, financial records showing the diversion of my inheritance funds to a trust benefiting Natalie Parker. Third, emails between Harold and Mark discussing strategies to dilute JT's control and transition leadership post-restructuring. Elena broke the silence first. "Harold, is this accurate? Has Taylor Technologies' ownership been restructured without proper disclosure to the board?" Harold's attorney leaned forward. "The company's capitalization table has evolved through standard investment procedures. Nothing improper has occurred." "Then perhaps you can explain this," I said, distributing a second set of documents. "These are records of my personal inheritance being used to purchase Taylor Technologies shares allocated to a trust benefiting Mark's executive assistant, with whom he is having an affair." Mark flinched visibly. One of the venture capitalist board members, Jonathan Price, removed his glasses in shock. "These are serious allegations. Harold, do you have a response?" Harold's composed exterior finally cracked. "This is a desperate attempt to distract from legitimate business concerns about Jessica's leadership. Personal matters between Mark and his wife should remain private." "I would agree," I replied calmly, "except when those personal matters involve company funds, fraudulent document signing, and attempts to seize control of a corporation through deception." The third set of documents I distributed included the forged amendment to my prenuptial agreement and meeting notes detailing the planned restructuring that would remove me as CEO. "As you can see," I continued, "this isn't about optimizing leadership for growth. It's about the Wilson family attempting to take control of Taylor Technologies by any means necessary, including fraud, misappropriation of funds, and corporate governance violations." The room erupted into multiple conversations. The Wilson, an associate's attorney, tried to regain control, while the independent directors huddled together, examining the evidence with increasing concern. Harold finally stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "These accusations are outrageous and will be addressed through proper channels. For now, let's focus on the matter at hand. The leadership restructuring proposal is on the table. As majority shareholders, the Wilson family interests recommend approval." "Actually," Diane spoke for the first time, her voice precise and authoritative, "the restructuring cannot proceed regardless of shareholder votes. Article 5, Section 3 of the incorporation document specifically requires approval from 75% of Class A shareholders for any modification to the executive structure. As Ms. Taylor holds 100% of Class A shares, this proposal requires her consent. That provision was intended to protect the founder during early growth stages, Harold's attorney argued. It's effectively superseded by subsequent investment agreements. Not according to Delaware corporate law, Diane countered. The provision remains binding unless specifically amended, which it has not been. Elena Martinez raised her hand, again, bringing order to the increasingly chaotic meeting. As lead independent director, I recommend we pause this discussion. These allegations require proper investigation before any vote on company restructuring can occur. I agree, said Jonathan. I move to table the restructuring proposal pending independent review of Ms. Taylor's claims. Seconded, added the third independent director, Christine Wong, looking visibly troubled by the documents before her. Harold's carefully orchestrated coup was unraveling before my eyes. His gaze, when it met mine, contained something I'd never seen directed at me before, genuine respect mixed with cold fury. Fine, he said tightly. We'll postpone the restructuring discussion. But Jessica's claims are grossly exaggerated and will be addressed appropriately. Including the misappropriation of my inheritance? I asked directly. The funds transferred without my consent to benefit Natalie Parker? Mark finally spoke, his voice strained. Jess, those funds were being managed for your benefit. There's been a misunderstanding. The trust documents explicitly name Natalie as the beneficiary, I interrupted. That's not a misunderstanding. Mark, it's fraud. Harold exchanged glances with his attorney, who gave a subtle headshake. Don't engage further on this topic. I have a counter-proposal, I said, seizing the moment. One that addresses both corporate governance and my personal concerns. Diane distributed the final set of documents, my terms for resolving the situation. Elena reviewed them first, eyebrows rising as she read. You're proposing Harold Wilson steps down from all involvement with Taylor Technologies, effective immediately. Mark Wilson transitions to a non-executive role. The Henderson acquisition proceeds as originally negotiated, and you continue as CEO with expanded powers. Harold laughed sharply. This is absurd. The Wilson family effectively controls this company through our investments. We've provided capital, connections, guidance, and systematic deception, I finished for him. My terms are reasonable considering the alternatives. Which are? Harold challenged. I take the evidence of financial fraud, including the misappropriation of my inheritance, to the authorities. I file suit against Wilson and Associates for breach of fiduciary duty. I publicly expose how Denver's most respected financial firm manipulated a tech founder while facilitating an affair between the founder's husband and his assistant. I imagine Wilson and Associates' reputation might suffer if clients learned about these activities. The threat hung in the air, its implications rippling through the room. Harold's reputation was the foundation of his business empire. Blixiar. Scandal involving fraud and corporate manipulation would devastate not just Wilson and Associates' standing, but the family legacy he'd spent decades building. You wouldn't, he said, but the uncertainty in his voice revealed his calculation. It would damage Taylor Technologies too. I built this company from nothing, I replied evenly. If necessary, I can do it again. The question is whether your reputation can survive a public fraud investigation. Mark looked stricken, his gaze darting between his father and me as the full implications of his actions crystallized. The woman he had betrayed now held the power to destroy his family's legacy and his own future. We need to discuss this privately, Harold finally said, gathering his documents with barely controlled anger. Of course, I agreed. The independent. Directors can oversee the investigation of my claims while you consider my proposal. I've already provided copies of all evidence to Diane for safekeeping. Elena nodded decisively, As lead independent director, I recommend we appoint an outside law firm to review these matters immediately. Ms. Taylor, will you continue as CEO during this process? Absolutely, I confirmed. Taylor Technologies operations will proceed without interruption, including the Henderson acquisition we've been planning for months. Harold's mouth tightened at this direct challenge to his authority, but he remained silent, the calculation visible behind his eyes. Fight and risk everything, or compromise and salvage what he could? This meeting is adjourned, Elena declared. We'll reconvene once the independent investigation has initial findings. As the board members filed out, Harold approached me, his voice low and controlled. You've made a serious miscalculation, Jessica. This won't end well. It already hasn't ended well, Harold, I replied quietly. For my marriage, for your son's integrity, for your family's claim to ethical business practices. I'm simply ensuring it doesn't end with me losing what I've built. He studied me with new eyes, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You're more like me than I realized. Perhaps that's why we've come to this impasse. No, Harold. I'm nothing like you. I don't take what isn't mine or manipulate those who trust me. The difference between us isn't ambition. It's integrity. I left him standing there, joining Diane, who waited by the door. As we walked back to my office, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. I had confronted the Wilson Empire and, at least temporarily, prevailed. But the war was far from over. Alicia was waiting in my office, her expression anxious. What happened? The executive team is buzzing with rumors about a board showdown. There's been a change in direction, I said carefully. For now, all Taylor Technologies operations continue as planned, especially the Henderson acquisition. I'll address the team formally once some details are finalized. After Alicia left, Diane and I assessed our position. They'll counter, she predicted. Harold won't surrender control easily, even with the evidence we have. Expect them to challenge. The Class A voting rights or claim the documents were obtained improperly. So, we prepare for Phase 2, I agreed. How quickly can we secure the Henderson acquisition? With the independent directors now supporting it, we could close within 2 weeks. But Jessica? Diane hesitated. What about your marriage? The question caught me off guard, personal concerns momentarily overshadowed by corporate strategy. There is no marriage, I said finally. There's just the legal dissolution of a partnership that was apparently fraudulent from the beginning. Do you want to file immediately, or wait until the company situation stabilizes? I considered this carefully. Let's focus on securing Taylor Technologies first. One battle at a time. Diane nodded. I'll have divorce papers prepared but not filed. And I'll start recovery proceedings for your inheritance and jewelry immediately. Those are straightforward claims, independent of the corporate issues. After she left, I sat alone in my office, staring out at the Denver skyline. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind a hollow ache. Despite the victory, I had lost my husband, my extended family, and any illusion of belonging in the world the Wilsons had seemed to offer. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. We need to talk, please. Before I could respond, another message arrived, this one from a number I didn't recognize. This is Natalie Parker. Whatever Mark has told you about us, there's more you should know. Can we meet? Interesting. Perhaps the Wilson men had underestimated more women than just me. For 3 days, I focused exclusively on stabilizing Taylor Technologies while the independent investigation proceeded. I met with our executive team, explaining that board-level discussions were underway about the company's future, but emphasizing that our strategic direction, including the Henderson acquisition, remained unchanged. What about the Wilsons? Asked James Chen, our chief product officer. Harold has been pushing his fintech fund investment for weeks. Are we still considering that? We're evaluating all investment opportunities based on strategic fit and return potential, I replied diplomatically. For now, focus on your teams and our product roadmap. Behind the scenes, I worked with Elena and the other independent directors to accelerate the Henderson acquisition. With the board power struggle exposed, they had shifted decisively to support my leadership, impressed not just by the evidence I'd presented, but by my composed handling of the crisis. The outside counsel's preliminary assessment supports your position on the Class A voting rights, Elena informed me during a private call. Harold can't force the restructuring without your consent, regardless of economic ownership percentage. And the financial irregularities? I asked. Concerning enough that we've authorized a broader audit. Jessica, this could have criminal implications for Harold and possibly Mark. Are you prepared for that? The question gave me pause. Despite everything, I had no desire to see Mark face criminal charges. Harold, perhaps, had earned whatever consequences came his way, but Mark seemed as much his father's victim as I was, shaped from childhood to value family legacy over personal integrity. I want corporate governance restored and my personal assets returned, I said carefully. Criminal charges aren't my objective, though I won't impede any necessary investigation. On the fourth day, Harold requested a private meeting through his personal attorney rather than Wilson and Associates counsel, a significant distinction that suggested he was separating family matters from corporate ones. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at Diane's law firm. Harold arrived alone, looking somehow diminished outside his usual power settings of the Wilson offices or mansion. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he began, uncharacteristically. Subdued. I've reviewed your proposal with my attorneys. We have a counteroffer. He slid a document across the table. Scanning it quickly, I saw that he had accepted most of my terms with some modifications. Harold would resign from direct involvement with Taylor Technologies, but retain advisory status on the board. Mark would transition to a non-executive role over 6 months rather than immediately. The Wilson family would maintain their economic interest as passive investors. Why the change of heart? I asked directly. Harold sighed, suddenly looking his age. The independent investigation has raised questions about certain financial transactions that could complicate matters for Wilson and Associates if made public. Pragmatism dictates compromise. Translation. The evidence was damning enough that fighting would risk his entire financial empire. And my inheritance? My grandmother's jewelry? The funds will be returned in full with interest, he confirmed. As for the jewelry, he hesitated. There's been a complication. My stomach tightened. What complication? Some pieces were given to Natalie by Mark. She's returned what she had, but your mother's sapphire pendant was apparently lost. The pendant, the one item of my mother's I had left, the piece that had passed from my grandmother to my mother and was meant to come to me. Its loss hit harder than any of the corporate manipulation. Lost, I repeated flatly, or sold. Harold shifted uncomfortably. I'm not privy to the details. Mark handled that directly. Anger flashed through me, hot and clarifying. Then, add another condition to my terms. Mark needs to recover that pendant, regardless of cost or difficulty. It's non-negotiable. Harold studied me for a long moment. Jessica, may I speak frankly? Not as a businessman, but as a father? I nodded. Cautiously. Mark made grievous errors of judgment, influenced significantly by my expectations and pressure. I don't excuse his actions, but I ask you to consider that he's been shaped by a familial legacy that prioritizes certain values above others. Like honesty, fidelity, basic respect? Harold winced. Like appearances, position, continuity of the Wilson name? I raised him to believe preserving our family legacy was paramount. Above personal happiness, above individual ethics sometimes. That's not an excuse, Harold. That's an indictment of your parenting. He didn't disagree. Perhaps. But I ask you to consider separating your justified anger at me from your feelings about Mark. He may yet become a better man than his father. The conversation revealed a side of Harold I'd never seen, reflective, almost remorseful. It didn't excuse his actions or lessen my resolve to protect Taylor Technologies, but it added complexity to a narrative I had simplified in my anger. "I'll consider your counteroffer," I said finally. "But the pendant is non-negotiable, and I'll need written confirmation about the return of my inheritance funds before signing anything." Harold nodded, standing to leave. At the door, he paused. "You would have made a formidable Wilson, Jessica, more than any of us deserved." After he left, Diane joined me, having monitored the meeting from an adjacent room. "Thoughts?" "We're close to resolution on the company front," I said. "But the personal issues remain complicated." "Mark has requested a meeting with you," she informed me, "without attorneys present. I advised against it, but the decision is yours." I considered the prospect of facing my husband alone, without the buffer of legal representatives or corporate business to focus on. Could I separate my justified anger at Harold from my feelings about Mark, as his father had asked? Did I even want to? "Set it up," I decided. "Tomorrow at our house. It's time Mark and I had an honest conversation, probably our first." As Diane gathered her papers, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Once this is resolved, what happens next? For you? For Taylor Technologies?" It was the future I hadn't allowed myself to contemplate yet, focused as I was on the immediate battle. Taylor Technologies continues its growth trajectory, starting with the Henderson acquisition. We expand into healthcare analytics as planned. Business proceeds. "And personally?" she pressed gently. I thought of the empty house that had never really felt like home, the marriage that had been built on calculation rather than love, the life I had tried to adapt myself to fit. "I rebuild," I said simply. "On my terms this time." I sat in the living room of what had once been our shared home, waiting for Mark to arrive. The house felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like an elaborate stage set where I'd performed the role of Mrs. Wilson. The sleek modern furniture, the carefully curated art collection, the designer kitchen where we rarely cooked, all of it seemed to belong to characters we had been playing rather than our authentic selves. The doorbell rang precisely at 7. Mark had always been punctual, a trait he attributed to business discipline, but which I now recognized as calculated control, the ability to dictate when encounters began and ended. He stood on the doorstep looking unexpectedly vulnerable, his usual corporate polish diminished by subtle signs of strain. The perfect Windsor knot in his tie had been replaced by a looser four-in hand. His normally immaculate hair showed evidence of anxious fingers running through it repeatedly. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I gestured toward the living room without responding. We sat across from each other, the sleek glass coffee table between us like a demilitarized zone. Mark glanced around, noticing small changes. My grandmother's Afghan now draped over the sofa, family photos I'd displayed that had previously been relegated to my office, personal touches reclaiming the space as mine. "Dad told me about your meeting," he began awkwardly. "The company situation seems to be resolving." "The company situation," I repeated, letting the euphemism hang in the air. "Is that what we're calling fraud, misappropriation, and corporate manipulation now?" Mark winced. "Jess, it wasn't supposed to happen this way. Things spiraled beyond what I intended." "What exactly did you intend, Mark? When you diverted my grandmother's money to a trust for your girlfriend? When you gave my mother's pendant to her? When you planned to push me out of my own company?" He leaned forward, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. "It wasn't that simple. Dad has certain expectations, the Wilson legacy, the family business traditions. When we got married, he saw you as an asset, your company as an extension of Wilson Holdings. I tried to protect your independence while keeping peace with my family. By betraying me on every possible level? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't soften the truth. I know it looks that way, Mark acknowledged, his gaze dropping to the floor. But it started with small compromises. First, letting Dad's firm handle the incorporation. It made sense, saved us money. Then accepting his strategic input. He does have experience we lacked. Then allowing more Wilson investment. We needed the capital. And somewhere along that path of small compromises, you decided it was acceptable to have an affair with your assistant, steal my inheritance, and conspire to take my company? Mark flinched at each accusation. The affair with Natalie, it wasn't planned. She understood the pressure I was under with Dad, with the family expectations. She'd grown up in that world. So I didn't understand you? Is that your justification? No, he said quickly. No justification. Just explanation. You were building something extraordinary, focused on your vision. I felt caught between your world and my father's, never quite measuring up in either. For the first time, I felt a flicker of pity for Mark Wilson. Not enough to forgive his betrayal, but enough to recognize the prison of expectations he'd inhabited since childhood. Harold had shaped his son to be the perfect Wilson heir, and deviating from that path had never seemed possible to Mark. And my inheritance? My mother's pendant? I kept my voice steady, though the loss of the pendant still cut deeper than any other betrayal. Mark's expression crumpled. That was unforgivable. Dad suggested establishing a trust with your inheritance for tax purposes. I didn't know until later he'd named Natalie as beneficiary. As for the pendant, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I never gave it to her. I lied to Dad about that. My breath caught as he placed the pouch on the table between us. With trembling fingers, I opened it, tipping the contents into my palm. My mother's sapphire pendant, the deep blue stone catching. The light just as I remembered, the silver setting slightly tarnished from years of careful storage. You kept it? My voice wavered, despite my efforts at control. I couldn't give it away. I knew what it meant to you. Mark's eyes held genuine regret. I told Dad I'd given it to Natalie, and she'd lost it because I knew that would end any chance of reconciliation. I wanted to make a clean break impossible. The calculation in this act, keeping the pendant to ensure I could never fully escape the Wilson orbit, was so manipulative it momentarily overshadowed the relief of having this precious piece of my history returned. Why are you returning it now? Mark looked away. Because I finally understand what I've lost. Not just my marriage, but my integrity. My sense of who I am apart from being Harold Wilson's son. He met my gaze directly. I can't undo what's been done, but I can stop making it worse. I closed my fingers around the pendant, its familiar weight both comforting and painful. Thank you for returning this. But it doesn't change anything between us. I know. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know about Natalie. My muscles tensed involuntarily. I'm not interested in details about your relationship. It's not about our relationship. It's about Taylor Technologies. Mark took a deep breath. Natalie didn't just happen to become my assistant. Dad placed her there specifically to help. Monitor your company's development. She has a finance background and specialized training in corporate intelligence. The revelation shouldn't have shocked me after everything else I'd discovered. But it did. She was a plant? From the beginning? Mark nodded reluctantly. Her family has connections to Wilson and Associates going back decades. When Taylor Technologies started showing significant promise, Dad brought her in to help position Wilson interests advantageously. And your affair? Was that part of Harold's strategy too? The question contained more bitterness than I intended to reveal. No, that was my own spectacular failure. Mark ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Dad actually disapproved. Not on moral grounds, but because it complicated his plans. He was grooming Natalie for a position in Wilson's new fintech division. The elaborate machinery of deception the Wilsons had constructed around me was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Every relationship, every business connection, even my marriage, all had been components in Harold's grand design to absorb my innovation into his empire. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because you deserve the complete truth, however ugly. And because I'm trying to find my way back to some kind of moral center." Mark's vulnerability seemed genuine, but I'd been fooled before. "Also, you should know that Natalie has been keeping records of questionable Wilson financial practices for years, her own insurance policy. She's willing to share them with you." This caught me by surprise. Why would she help me? Self-preservation primarily. She knows which way the wind is blowing, but also... Mark hesitated. "I think she respects you. She's seen what you've built, despite all the obstacles the Wilsons put in your path. The idea that my husband's mistress might respect me created a cognitive dissonance I wasn't prepared to process. I'll consider speaking with her." Mark nodded, then stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "The divorce papers. Dad mentioned you're having them prepared." "Yes, Diane is handling it. I won't contest anything. Whatever settlement you propose, I'll accept it." The offer should have felt like victory, but instead it just underscored the hollowness of what our marriage had become, a business arrangement being efficiently dissolved. "Goodbye, Mark." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet house, the pendant clutched in my hand, trying to reconcile the multiple versions of reality I'd inhabited in recent years. The ambitious software developer who'd fallen in love with a charming investor. The dedicated entrepreneur building her company while supporting her husband's career. The dutiful daughter-in-law trying to earn acceptance from a prominent family. All those identities had been partially fiction, roles in an elaborate play written and directed by Harold Wilson. The next morning, I met with Elena Martinez at a small cafe far from both the Wilson Building and Denver's business district. As lead independent director, Elena had become my most crucial ally in stabilizing Taylor Technologies during the transition. "The outside counsel has completed their review," she informed me, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Their findings support your position on all key governance issues. The board has officially endorsed your continued leadership as CEO and approved the Henderson acquisition without Wilson involvement." I skimmed the report, relief washing over me as I confirmed that Taylor Technologies was legally secure regardless of the Wilson family's economic stake. "And the inheritance funds?" "Full restitution has been initiated. Diane should receive confirmation today." Elena studied me with concern. "How are you holding up personally?" The question caught me off guard. Throughout the crisis, I'd compartmentalized rigorously, focusing on business strategy, legal maneuvers, and tactical responses while suppressing the emotional aftermath of discovering my entire marriage had been built on calculation rather than love. "I'm managing," I said, the standard response I'd given everyone. But Elena deserved more honesty. "Actually, I'm not sure. Professionally, everything is proceeding as it should. Personally, it's complicated." Elena nodded understanding. At 62, she had navigated the male-dominated tech world for decades, breaking barriers and undoubtedly facing her own betrayals along the way. "When my first company was acquired, my co-founder, also my fiancé at the time, negotiated a separate deal behind my back," she shared unexpectedly. "He walked away with twice my compensation and a senior position at the acquiring company, while I was offered a minor role with limited authority." "What did you do?" I asked, grateful for her willingness to share her experience. "I declined their offer, took my reduced payout, and started again. 2 years later, my new company became their biggest competitor." She smiled slightly at the memory. The point is, Jessica, this moment of betrayal doesn't define your story. It's just a particularly difficult chapter. Her perspective helped reframe my situation. I had been viewing recent events as the collapse of the life I'd built, but perhaps they were actually the foundation of something more authentic. A future built on my terms, rather than accommodating Wilson family expectations. I've been so focused on what I've lost, I admitted. My marriage, my relationship with a family I thought had accepted me, certain assumptions about my life's trajectory. And now you get to redefine all of that, Elena pointed out. Not many people receive such a clean slate mid-career. Her reframing stayed with me as I drove to my next appointment, a meeting with Natalie Parker at a discreet hotel bar across town. I'd debated whether to meet her at all, but professional pragmatism had overcome personal aversion. If she truly had records of questionable Wilson financial practices, that information could provide additional leverage in finalizing the separation between Taylor Technologies and Wilson and Associates. Natalie was already seated at a corner table. When I arrived, her posture straight and professional despite the personal awkwardness of our situation. Up close, I could see why Mark had been attracted to her. She was conventionally beautiful in a polished way that aligned perfectly with Wilson family aesthetics. But there was also an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was more than the corporate spy Mark had described. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "I understand your reluctance." "Let's keep this professional," I suggested, sitting down across from her. "Mark mentioned you have information about Wilson financial practices. That might be relevant to me." She nodded, opening her designer handbag and removing a USB drive. 6 years of financial records documenting how Harold Wilson has systematically used client funds to shore up Wilson family investments, manipulated company valuations for favorable tax treatment, and created shell entities to obscure financial flows between related parties. I made no move to take the drive. "Why are you giving me this?" Natalie met my gaze directly. "Self-preservation, primarily. Harold Wilson is going down. Maybe not publicly if you accept his settlement offer, but within financial circles word is spreading. I need to be on the right side of that fall." Her honesty was refreshing after years of Wilson family manipulations cloaked in concern and support. "And secondarily?" A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed her face. "Professional. Admiration. You built something genuine that the Wilsons couldn't create themselves, so they tried to take it. That's not how business should work." "But you participated in their scheme." "I did," she acknowledged without defensiveness. "I was brought into Wilson and Associates directly from business school, groomed for a specific role in Harold's organization. The assignment to monitor Taylor Technologies through Mark was presented as a standard corporate intelligence operation, not personal sabotage." "And your relationship with my husband? Was that also a standard operation?" To her credit, Natalie didn't flinch. "That was unexpected and unprofessional. I won't insult you by claiming it was anything other than a serious lapse in judgment on both our parts." Her matter-of-fact ownership of her actions was oddly disarming. No excuses, no emotional justifications, just acknowledgement of facts. "What do you want in exchange for this information?" I asked, gesturing toward the USB drive she still held. "Distance from the fallout. When you finalize your separation from the Wilsons, both personally and professionally, I'd appreciate confirmation that I'm not named in any public statements or legal proceedings." It was a reasonable request, and one that aligned with my own preference to resolve matters as cleanly and privately as possible. I nodded agreement. "There's something else you should know," Natalie added, her professional demeanor slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. "Harold is more desperate than he appears. The Wilson and Associates financial position has been precarious for nearly 2 years. Over-leveraged investments, client withdrawals following some questionable practices, regulatory scrutiny of their offshore operations. Mark never mentioned any financial troubles." Mark doesn't know the full extent of it. Harold compartmentalizes information rigorously, even within the family. Your company's success made it an attractive acquisition target, not just for its technology and market position, but as a potential source of liquid capital to stabilize Wilson and Associates. The revelation cast Harold's machinations in an even more calculating light. He hadn't just wanted control of Taylor Technologies. As another Wilson family holding, he had needed it as a financial lifeline. "How bad is it?" I asked. Without significant capital infusion or asset liquidation, Wilson and Associates could face insolvency within 18 months. I took the USB drive, our fingers not touching during the exchange. "Thank you for the information. I'll honor our agreement regarding your name being kept out of any proceedings." Natalie nodded, standing to leave. At the last moment, she hesitated. For what it's worth, Mark did love you, in his way. He just never learned how to love someone more than he feared disappointing his father. Her insight into Mark's psychology was uncomfortably perceptive, suggesting a deeper understanding between them than mere physical attraction. I offered. No response, and she walked away, her confident stride betraying none of the complicated emotions our meeting must have evoked. Back at my office, I handed the USB drive to Diane for review by her cybersecurity team before we accessed any files. "Trust but verify," she said approvingly. "Who knows what might actually be on this device?" While waiting for the security clearance, I met with Alicia to discuss accelerating the Henderson acquisition timeline. "Their CEO is ready to sign as soon as we give the green light," she confirmed. "The integration team has already mapped out the first 90 days of technical merger activities." "Let's move forward immediately," I decided. "Schedule the signing for tomorrow if possible. I want this deal locked in before any other complications arise." Alicia raised an eyebrow at my urgency but asked no questions. Her loyalty throughout the crisis had been unwavering, her focus on Taylor Technologies operations allowing me to concentrate on the Wilson situation without our core business suffering. "There's another matter we should discuss," she said carefully. "The executive team has concerns about our continuing presence in the Wilson building. Given recent developments, it creates both practical and symbolic challenges." She was right, of course. Remaining in space owned by Wilson and Associates complicated everything from daily operations to company morale. "Options?" I asked. "I've identified 3 potential locations that could accommodate our current staff plus Henderson's team. All are available for immediate occupancy with flexible lease terms." She handed me a folder with property details. "The River North Tech corridor space is my recommendation. Modern infrastructure, room for growth, and appropriately distanced from any Wilson associations." The thorough preparation reminded me why Alicia had been my second hire. Her ability to anticipate needs and present solutions rather than problems had been invaluable throughout Taylor Technologies' growth. "Schedule viewings for tomorrow after the Henderson signing," I instructed. "And Alicia, thank you for everything these past weeks." She smiled slightly. "Just doing my job. Though I must admit, watching you outmaneuver Harold Wilson has been professionally satisfying. The man has interrupted me in meetings to ask for coffee 6 times since we moved into this building." That evening, Diane called with 2 significant updates. First, the security team cleared Natalie's USB drive. It contains exactly what she claimed: extensive documentation of questionable Wilson financial practices, some potentially crossing into illegal territory. And the second update? "Your divorce terms have been accepted without contest. Mark has signed everything, agreeing to all proposed settlements and confidentiality provisions. Additionally, Harold has countersigned the corporate separation agreement, accepting your terms for disentangling Taylor Technologies from Wilson and Associates oversight." The swift capitulation confirmed what Natalie had revealed. The Wilsons needed this resolved quickly and quietly, their apparent strength masking significant vulnerability. What happens now? I asked, feeling strangely deflated by the anticlimax. After weeks of high-stakes confrontation and strategic planning, the matter was concluding with signatures on documents rather than dramatic showdowns. Now you rebuild, Diane said, echoing my own earlier words. Professionally, you've already started with the Henderson acquisition and new office search. Personally, she hesitated. That's not my area of expertise, but I imagine it involves similar principles. Assess what remains, determine what you want to construct, and begin laying new foundations. The corporate resolution process moved with surprising speed once Harold recognized his limited options. Within 2 weeks, Taylor Technologies had completed the Henderson acquisition, relocated to our new River North headquarters, and restructured our board to replace Wilson-affiliated directors with independent technology and finance leaders. The Wilson family retained their economic interest in the company as passive investors, but with no management influence or board representation. My ownership position was solidified through a new share structure that maintained the Class A voting protections while creating additional equity incentives for key employees and the incoming Henderson team. Throughout this transition, I maintained minimal personal contact with Mark or Harold, conducting necessary communications through attorneys. The divorce proceeded without drama, the settlement terms generous enough to avoid contest, but structured to ensure complete separation of our financial and legal entanglements. The sapphire pendant remained in my office desk drawer, not yet integrated into my daily life, but no longer lost. Like so many aspects of this ordeal, its return represented both closure and new beginning. Recovery of what was wrongfully taken, but altered by the experience of loss and betrayal. 6 weeks after the board meeting showdown, I invited Elena Martinez to tour our new headquarters. As we walked through the open, light-filled space with its collaborative workstations and glass-walled meeting rooms, her approval was evident. "You've created something remarkable here," she observed as we paused in the reception area where the Taylor Technologies logo, redesigned without the Wilson blue, now adorned the wall in vibrant teal and silver. "Not just the company, but the culture. These people believe in your vision." "Our vision," I corrected gently. "The executive team and board have been instrumental in shaping what Taylor Technologies is becoming." "Speaking of becoming," Elena said as we entered my office overlooking the downtown skyline, "have you given thought to what's next for you personally? Professional success is clearly on track, but there's more to life than corporate achievements." The question touched on considerations I'd been deliberately avoiding. With Taylor Technologies secure and my marriage concluded, I had unprecedented freedom to redefine my personal identity and priorities. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'm establishing the Rose Taylor Memorial Scholarship for Women in Technology," I shared, using my inheritance funds plus a matching contribution from Taylor Technologies. Beyond that, I'm still figuring it out. Elena nodded understanding. The hardest transitions are often not the ones imposed on us, but the ones where we suddenly have true choice after periods of constraint. Exactly. For years, my identity was shaped by external forces, being Mark Wilson's wife, navigating Wilson family expectations, building Taylor Technologies within parameters others established. Now those constraints are gone, and I'm rediscovering who Jessica Taylor actually is without those defined roles. "And who is she?" Elena asked with genuine curiosity. I gestured toward the window, where construction cranes dotted the Denver skyline, tangible evidence of growth and transformation. Still under construction, but the foundation is solid and the architectural plans are becoming clearer every day. Later that afternoon, I met with the Henderson Systems team to review integration progress. Their patient outcome prediction model was already being incorporated into our healthcare analytics platform, with preliminary results exceeding even our optimistic projections. The collaborative energy between our development teams suggested cultural integration was proceeding as smoothly as technical integration. As the meeting concluded, Michael Henderson, the former CEO who now led our healthcare division, lingered behind. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, his typically reserved manner softened by evident sincerity. When the acquisition discussions began, we had interest from several larger companies, but chose Taylor Technologies because of your reputation for ethical leadership and innovative culture. Recent events have only confirmed that was the right decision. His acknowledgement touched me unexpectedly. Throughout the Wilson crisis, I had focused on legal strategies and corporate maneuvers, with little time to consider the human impact of leadership decisions on our expanded team. "The integration is succeeding because of the foundation you built at Henderson," I responded. "Your team's expertise and values align perfectly with our mission." "Speaking of integration," Michael said, his professional tone shifting slightly, "a few of us are trying that new bistro down the street after work. Nothing formal, just colleagues unwinding. You'd be welcome to join us." The invitation represented something I hadn't experienced in years: casual professional socialization without Wilson family oversight or expectations. Just colleagues appreciating each other's company without hidden agendas. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. That evening, sharing appetizers and conversation with the Henderson team, I caught a glimpse of the future taking shape. Professional relationships built on mutual respect, personal connections developing organically without manipulation, a life constructed according to my own values rather than externally imposed expectations. When I finally returned home, to the Cherry Creek house I had decided to keep despite its Wilson associations, now redecorated to reflect my own aesthetic, I removed the sapphire pendant from its velvet pouch. The blue stone caught the light as I fastened it around my neck, its weight familiar and yet transformed by all that had happened since I last wore it. In my grandmother's jewelry box, I found a small folded note in her handwriting that I hadn't noticed before. "Remember who you are," it read simply, "not who others expect you to be." Standing before the mirror, I saw not the polished Mrs. Wilson of recent years, nor the ambitious software developer of my early career, but someone new, emerging from the crucible of betrayal and reclamation, stronger, clearer, and finally, authentically herself. 6 months after the Wilson family separation, Taylor Technologies celebrated the successful launch of our healthcare analytics platform. The integration of Henderson Systems technology had accelerated our development timeline, allowing us to bring a revolutionary patient outcome prediction tool to market ahead of schedule. Major hospital systems across the country had begun implementing our solution, with preliminary data showing significant improvements in treatment effectiveness and resource allocation. The launch party, held in our River North headquarters, represented more than just a product milestone. It was the public debut of Taylor Technologies as a fully independent entity, free from Wilson influence or oversight. Industry press mingled, with healthcare executives and technology partners, all witnessing the company's transformation from promising startup to established market leader. "Remarkable achievement, Jessica," Elena commented as we observed the networking happening around us. From corporate crisis to industry transformation in half a year. Not many leaders could navigate that journey successfully. "Not many leaders have support networks like I've been fortunate to find," I replied, genuinely appreciative of how my professional circle had expanded since breaking free from the Wilson orbit. "The independent board you helped assemble has been instrumental in this transition." "Speaking of transitions," Elena said, lowering her voice slightly, "have you heard the latest about Wilson and Associates?" I hadn't spoken directly with Mark or Harold since finalizing our separation agreements, but industry gossip inevitably reached me. Something about restructuring their asset management division? Elena nodded. "That's the public story. The reality is more dramatic. 3 major institutional clients pulled their portfolios last month. The SEC has opened a formal investigation into their offshore investment practices. and I heard from a reliable source that they're liquidating their Aspen property to shore up operating capital. The news confirmed what Natalie had revealed months earlier. Wilson and Associates was in serious financial trouble, their carefully maintained facade of prosperity crumbling under regulatory scrutiny and client departures. While vindication might have been a natural response, I felt an unexpected complexity of emotions. The Wilson Empire's collapse would affect innocent employees and clients, not just Harold and his family. I hope they find a way to restructure ethically, I said finally. Too many people depend on that firm for their livelihoods. Elena studied me with approval. Most people in your position would be celebrating their downfall. Revenge is exhausting. I'd rather focus my energy on building something meaningful. The sentiment wasn't practiced or performative. It reflected a genuine shift in my priorities since reclaiming my company and personal autonomy. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with Michael Henderson, whose healthcare division was now the fastest-growing segment of our business. What had begun as collegial appreciation had evolved into something more personal. Over recent months, dinners that extended beyond professional discussions, weekend hikes in the Colorado mountains, shared interests discovered gradually without pressure or agenda. The Cleveland hospital system called today, he informed me, his characteristic reserve softened by excitement. Their preliminary results show a 22% improvement in treatment optimization using our platform. They're expanding implementation to all departments 6 months ahead of schedule. That's not just a business win, I noted. That's real people receiving better care because of what we've built together. Michael's smile reached his eyes in the way I'd come to appreciate, genuine, unguarded, without the calculated charm that had once attracted me to Mark. Precisely why I was so determined to partner with Taylor Technologies. Your vision always extended beyond profit margins to actual human impact. Later that evening, as the event wound down, I stood alone in my office, looking out at the Denver skyline illuminated against the night sky. The woman reflected in the window glass was both familiar and transformed, still recognizably Jessica Taylor, but with a quiet confidence that came from surviving betrayal and emerging stronger. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark, the first direct communication in months. Congratulations on the healthcare platform launch. The press coverage is impressive. I'm genuinely happy for your success. The message was unexpectedly straightforward, without the manipulative subtext that had characterized so many of our interactions. After a moment's consideration, I replied simply, "Thank you." Another message followed. "I'm leaving Wilson and Associates, starting fresh with a smaller firm in Chicago next month." This was significant news, Mark breaking away from his father's firm, the legacy he had been groomed to inherit since childhood. "A clean start seems wise," I responded neutrally. "It's long overdue," came his reply. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others. Wishing you continued success, Jessica." The exchange left me reflective rather than vindictive. Mark had been as much Harold's victim as perpetrator, shaped from birth to prioritize family legacy over personal integrity. His moral compass calibrated to Wilson standards rather than universal principles. His departure from the family firm suggested he was finally attempting to establish his own identity, independent of Harold's influence. The following morning, I met with our executive team to review the healthcare platform launch metrics and discuss next quarter's priorities. The collaborative energy in the room reflected Taylor Technologies' evolved culture. Diverse perspectives freely shared, innovative ideas welcomed regardless of organizational hierarchy, decisions made transparently, based on data rather than politics. The integration team has identified additional synergies between our retail analytics engine and the healthcare predictive models, James reported, his enthusiasm evident. We could potentially expand into pharmaceutical supply chain optimization with minimal additional development resources. That aligns perfectly with our strategic roadmap, Alicia noted. Several existing clients have already inquired about capabilities in that direction. Let's explore it further, I agreed. Draft. A preliminary scope and resource requirements for review next week. If it's viable, we could include it in our Q3 development cycle. The meeting continued with similar collaborative problem-solving across departments, each leader contributing expertise without the territorial protectiveness that had sometimes characterized our operations under Wilson influence. As CEO, I found myself facilitating more than directing, creating space for our talented team to innovate rather than imposing a singular vision. After the meeting, I had lunch scheduled with Diane, whose counsel had evolved from crisis management to strategic advice as Taylor Technologies stabilized. We met at a small farm-to-table restaurant near her office, the casual setting reflecting our relationship's transition from formal legal representation to something approaching friendship. The Wilson and Associates situation is deteriorating rapidly, she informed me after we ordered. The SEC investigation has expanded to include potential securities fraud allegations. Several partners are negotiating separate settlements to avoid individual liability. And Harold? I asked, curious despite myself. Fighting to maintain control, but the board is increasingly resistant to his leadership. There's talk of forcing him into retirement to facilitate a comprehensive restructuring. The news represented a dramatic reversal from just a year earlier, when Harold Wilson had seemed invincible, a titan of Denver finance whose influence extended across business and society. His fall demonstrated how quickly apparent strength could collapse when built on manipulation rather than solid ethical foundations. Do you regret not pursuing more aggressive legal action against them? Diane asked, always direct in her assessments. With what we discovered, you could have initiated criminal proceedings rather than accepting the negotiated settlement. I considered this question carefully, wanting my answer to reflect genuine introspection rather than practiced nobility. Pursuing criminal charges might have been justified, but it would have kept me emotionally tethered to the Wilsons for years. The settlement allowed me to reclaim what mattered most: my company, my inheritance, my autonomy, without remaining entangled in their downfall. Diane nodded, accepting this reasoning. And personally? The divorce was finalized months ago, but healing from betrayal takes longer than legal proceedings. I'm discovering who Jessica Taylor is outside of her relationship to the Wilson family, I replied, the answer emerging more easily than it would have even weeks earlier. Building friendships based on mutual respect rather than calculation. Exploring interests I'd set aside during my marriage. Leading my company according to my values without compromise. And Michael Henderson? Diane asked with uncharacteristic directness, a slight smile suggesting she'd noticed our interactions at recent events. I felt a flicker of self-consciousness, but answered honestly. A colleague whose company I enjoy. Whatever might develop beyond that will happen organically, without agenda or pressure. That approach to relationships, professional and personal, might be your most significant reclamation, Diane observed perceptively. The freedom to let connections evolve naturally, rather than strategically. Her insight resonated deeply. Throughout my marriage, relationships had been evaluated primarily for their utility, what advantages they offered, what doors they opened, how they advanced Wilson family interests. Even my own worth had been measured by what I could contribute to the Wilson legacy rather than my inherent value as a person. That evening, I finalized plans for the Rose Taylor Memorial Scholarship Program, which would provide comprehensive support for women pursuing technology degrees at Colorado universities. The initiative would honor my grandmother's belief in education as the path to independence, offering not just financial assistance but mentorship from Taylor Technologies' female executives and internship opportunities with our development teams. As I worked on the scholarship documentation, I wore my mother's sapphire pendant, a tangible connection to my family history and authentic self. The piece had acquired new significance since its return, symbolizing not just what I had almost lost, but what I had reclaimed through standing firm in my convictions. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID displayed Michael Henderson, and I felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation as I answered. Jessica. His voice carried its usual calm assurance. I apologize for calling after hours. I just received word that Mayo Clinic wants to pilot our platform in their oncology department. They're sending a team next week to discuss implementation details. That's extraordinary news, I replied, genuinely excited. Mayo Clinic represented healthcare's gold standard. Their adoption would accelerate industry acceptance exponentially. We should assemble our clinical advisory board to prepare for their visit. Already in progress, Michael confirmed, but that's not actually why I called. He paused, his typically confident tone giving way to something more hesitant. I have tickets to the Denver Symphony this weekend, Beethoven's Ninth. I wondered if you might want to join me. Not as colleagues discussing business opportunities, but simply as us. The invitation's directness was refreshing. No hidden agenda, no calculated social engineering, just a straightforward expression of interest in spending time together beyond our professional connection. I'd like that very much, I replied, surprised by how naturally the acceptance came. Excellent, Michael said, warmth evident in his voice. I'll pick you up at 7 on Saturday? After we said goodbye, I remained at my desk, contemplating how different this interaction felt from the calculated courtship Mark had conducted years earlier. There was no family dynasty evaluating my suitability, no corporate acquisition disguised as romance, just two people exploring a potential connection transparently. The following weekend, as Michael and I walked through Denver Botanic Gardens following the symphony, our conversation flowed naturally between professional topics and personal experiences. Unlike my relationship with Mark, which had always centered around Wilson family dynamics and business interactions, this emerging connection existed entirely outside those power structures, founded on mutual respect rather than strategic advantage. You seem different lately, Michael observed as we paused by a reflective pool at the garden's center. More at ease with yourself. I am, I acknowledged, appreciating his perception. For years, I was trying to fit into a role that was never designed for an actual person, just an idealized Wilson wife who would advance family interests while suppressing her own identity. Breaking free from that expectation has been liberating. Freedom can be disorienting at first, he offered, speaking from his own experience of selling the company he had built over a decade. When we've defined ourselves through certain frameworks for so long, authentic self-determination feels simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. His understanding reflected one of the qualities I most appreciated about Michael, the ability to recognize complexities without trying to simplify them into convenient narratives. Our connection was developing without predetermined patterns or expectations, each interaction building naturally upon shared values and experiences. As summer transitioned to fall, Taylor Technologies continued its upward trajectory. The healthcare platform expanded into additional medical specialties, our retail analytics maintained market leadership, and a new data privacy initiative reinforced our commitment to ethical technology development. Industry recognition accumulated through innovation awards and favorable analyst coverage, validating our independent path. Occasionally, news about the Wilsons reached me through business publications or industry conversations. Wilson & Associates had undergone significant restructuring, with Harold forced into retirement and external leadership appointed to salvage the firm's reputation. Mark had established himself at a boutique investment firm in Chicago, deliberately, distancing himself from his father's business methods while maintaining family connections. These developments registered as information rather than emotional triggers, relevant to understanding Denver's business landscape, but no longer central to my personal narrative. The Wilsons had been a chapter in my story, not its defining plot. 1 year after the boardroom confrontation that had changed everything, I stood at the podium during Taylor Technologies' annual company gathering, looking out at the expanded team that now included over 200 employees. Today, we celebrate not just our business achievements, I told them, but the culture of innovation, integrity, and inclusion we've built together. Taylor Technologies exists to create technology that genuinely improves lives, from retail experiences to healthcare outcomes, while honoring the dignity of everyone involved in that mission. As applause filled the room, I felt a profound sense of alignment between my professional purpose and personal values. The integration of who I was with, what I built without compromise or compartmentalization. The inheritance I had fought to reclaim wasn't just financial resources or company control, but something far more valuable: the right to define my own identity and chart my own course. Later that evening, reading congratulatory messages from colleagues and industry partners, I came across a newspaper announcement forwarded by Elena, Harold Wilson's retirement gala coverage in Denver's Society pages. The accompanying photograph showed Harold accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award from the city's financial community, his expression revealing the strain beneath his composed exterior. Natalie Parker stood in the background among other Wilson and Associates employees, her gaze directed toward the camera with unreadable intensity. The image stirred complex emotions rather than simple vindication. Harold had built his empire through manipulation and ethical compromise, yet much of his work had genuinely benefited clients and the community. His methods deserved condemnation, but his contributions merited acknowledgement. Human legacies rarely sorted neatly into heroes and villains. Most contained elements of both, their ultimate impact determined by the balance between harm and benefit they created in the world. I closed the article, turning instead to finalize details for tomorrow's launch of the Rose Taylor Memorial Scholarship. My grandmother's wisdom continued guiding my path forward. Remember who you are, not who others expect you to be. In reclaiming my inheritance, both material and spiritual, I had finally become fully myself, neither defined by the Wilson family's rejection nor confined by their acceptance. My journey from betrayal to reclamation had transformed not just my circumstances, but my fundamental understanding of value, what truly constituted wealth worth inheriting and legacy worth building. As I fastened my mother's sapphire pendant around my neck, its weight familiar and comforting, I recognized that the most important inheritance wasn't the company I'd fought to protect or the funds I'd recovered, but the conviction to live authentically, regardless of external pressures or expectations. That inheritance, unlike any material possession, could never be taken away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.